Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as ever, to the papers. The Sunday Telegraph has a highly political front page there. Number 10 plots a Brexit walkout. Rather oddly, ministers have been briefing business that at some point in the summer, possibly in September, Theresa May will walk out of those negotiations. Sounds slightly odd, but nonetheless, very important story down the back here. Justine Greening, the Education Secretary, is asking for an extra £1 billion for schools. That is the public spending story, or part of it, that I was referring to at the beginning of the programme. The Sunday Times has a disturbing account here, alleging that an investigation into a rogue SAS unit who killed civilians is being covered up, or is about to be covered up, and again the austerity story there. We move on. You heard the fishing story. There's the Sunday Express splashing on it. No foreign fishing in our waters. But is that absolutely true? We'll find out later on. The Observer has top Tories revolt against May over public sector cash. This is a big, big theme in today's papers. And then finally, it's a Love Island bloodbath. We'll be talking a great deal about that story later on. No, we won't. That's a lie. I'm sorry. And finally, the Mail on Sunday there. Again, Tory chaos over tuition fees U-turn, it says. And we're going to pick up on that straight away, I think, with Heidi.
I'm disappointed we're not talking about Love Island, to be honest.
You can talk about Love Island if you'd like, of course, but it's not quite our normal thing on this programme, Heidi.
Indeed.
No, no.
So the top story around Justine Greening and the funding for schools. So a number of us, for some time, the funding formula, as you know, was out for consultation, and we felt that the numbers, the machine just didn't work. And those of us who've been significantly underfunded, my area included, for decades, the funding still isn't there. So great that we're seeing Justine coming out and saying, yes, we need to get some more funding in there for schools.
So, and to be clear, the politics of this, you're South Cambridgeshire, but all across the country, there's been a kind of revolt by younger voters against the Conservatives, and a sense that it was on issues like school funding, but above all tuition fees, that they were coming out, and that therefore the Tories have to change direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funding for schools, that isn't just young people, families feel that too. I'm not so sure myself around tuition fees. I think the biggest risk for us is that we just start chasing Jeremy Corbyn's policies, because I don't think that will do any favours. I'm not sure young voters will find that credible. So I'm not convinced about the angle to...
But also, if you're going to get an extra £1 billion for schools, as for Northern Ireland and so on and so on, then you need to find the money, which might mean raising taxes before too long.
Yes, and that is a possibility. I'm also disappointed that we didn't stand firm on the triple lock, taking the triple lock away from pensions, because there wasn't a single pensioner that I talked to that didn't agree once it's explained to them, and that would have given us £6 billion a year.
An explaining time, yeah.
Yeah.
Tim, you're looking a slightly kind of sceptical expression on your face, if I may say so. Yeah. Are you concerned that the Tories have effectively thrown in the towel on public spending?
Well, if no one will defend the Tory record on spending, including a Tory MP, then I will happily step forward and do it. That is what they were elected to do in 2010, of course, to get the spending under control. In the next 7 years, they did not do what Ireland did. It wasn't a race to the bottom. On the contrary, the cuts were fairly slow, they were targeted, there was welfare reform. They also ring-fenced certain departments like health and foreign aid. The idea that they've simply closed down the welfare state for business is just nonsense. What this shows is a collapse of political discipline. And that is troubling. You cannot have a government with a vacuum at its centre, with a Prime Minister who accepts any demand that comes to her. And one thing I agree with Heidi about, you were very critical about the DUP deal, is it does seem as though that was the beginning. When the government sold itself for £1 billion, when it said, here's the money, please keep us in power, I think that opened the floodgates. And if you're going to give £1 billion to the DUP, then why on earth wouldn't the heads of department come forward and say, OK, well, we'd like a bit more for teachers or doctors?
Absolutely right. Naomi, you've chosen, I think, the front page of the Mail on Sunday on the same story. It's all over the place, isn't it?
But, you know, I disagree. I don't think, you know, I think this is cumulative. I think it goes back further. This money tree you keep talking about, I feel like this generation of voters that is so excited about Jeremy Corbyn here and, you know, in North America that energized the Bernie Sanders campaign, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they saw the money tree in 2008 with the financial crisis, and they saw trillions of dollars and euros and pounds being marshaled to save the elites, to save the banks. And that's when the spell of austerity started to break, right? I mean, you can't bail out the rich and have people fail to notice that the schools, there's never money for schools, there's never money for health care. So I think it's been a slow process which began with a rejection of that bailout and a big no around the world, but didn't have the courage to put forward, well, maybe this is what we should spend the money on and this is what our world could look like instead. But also this idea that the Tories can just kind of suddenly adopt Labour's policies. What I see happening, and not just in this country, but also in North America and to some extent in France as well, with the support for Mélenchon during the election, particularly among young people, is a trust for people who've been saying the same thing for many decades, right, in this era of focus grouped politics.
And you've written about this in your new book, which I will come on to in just a second. But before we do, Heidi Allen, you are very, very critical of the DUP deal. You said you could barely contain your anger about it. And when I read your speech, I thought, here is somebody who is on the edge of leaving the Conservative Party.
No, I hope I'm on the edge of seeing the Conservative Party come back, the one that I know can and should be there. We have got to change our tone and our language. I think we've become too inward-looking. We've forgotten the purpose, you know, why we're there. And I'm reminded constantly when I talk to my constituents of what they're looking for. And they want the Tory party to change as well.
And this is pressure from the bottom. You've got the story, I think, of the NHS staff in the Telegraph to talk about.
Yeah,
The Observer, I beg your pardon.
So this is around a book written by a junior doctor about what life's like, which of course feeds on the back of the debate around the pay freeze for nurses in particular. And I had a surgery yesterday. I had a doctor come to see me who describes pressures the like of which she has never experienced. And we need to look at supporting all our public services, but the NHS, I think, particularly at the moment, is really, really struggling. So whether it's junior doctor contracts, the pay freeze, these people are very, very overworked, and we need to look to see what we can do to support them.
Now, the biggest fish in the pool of political correspondents, at least physically, is Tim Shipman in the Sunday Times. And he's got an interview with Michael Gove, who's coming on the show in a moment.
Yes.
Tim, just tell us a little bit about the interview and what you make of it.
Well, of course, we have a whole goldfish bowl of excellent correspondence at the Telegraph, I want to say. But it's true the Times does have an excellent interview with him. This is very important. Gove is back. Politically, that's significant because, of course, he got in so much trouble after the referendum. He was told by Theresa May, go to the backbenches and prove yourself, which he appears to have done. He has come back and he's been given, arguably, the most important post-Brexit job of all, and that's agriculture. Most important because agriculture in this country is so reliant upon EU subsidies, and so many people in agriculture voted for Brexit, but they arguably could be the ones most economically hurt by it.
And all the government has said is that we're not going to cut subsidies until 2022, but for a farmer that's not very long ahead.
But here he does actually come up with he does put some meat on the bone. He does have some serious policies. We know Britain's leaving the London Convention on Fisheries. We know that's going to happen, but he also mentions that he might be thinking about a ban on live exports, which is brilliant if you're a fan of animal welfare. And he also hints that there will be a sort of redistribution of the subsidies, that those who simply get them because they have a lot of land will see them cut back, and there'll be a focus instead upon good maintenance of the land. So it's interesting to see him already fleshing out some ideas.
Naomi Klein, we'll talk a little bit about regulation and so forth in the US context, but one of the things that people want in this country is a big new free trade deal with the US. And in that context, the American farming lobby is very powerful, and they have lots of techniques that we don't allow here, whether it's chlorine-washed chicken or use of certain hormones in beef and so forth. In those talks, how big a say will American farmers have, do you think?
Well, you always have to make a distinction between American agribusiness companies, who will have a huge say, and American farmers who've been
on the other hand,
put out of business for a long time because of the extraordinary control of companies like Cargill and Monsanto. But you know, this certainly relates to this all-out assault on regulations that the Trump administration is pushing through, with all attention focused on the president's tweets and trolling of television anchors and the Russia investigations and so on. Meanwhile, there is this methodical attack on regulation. So when Britain talks about a trade deal which would require a degree of harmonization with the United States, it's important for people here to understand that the bar is being lowered very, very dramatically in areas where it is easy to do so. so, particularly the Environmental Protection Agency. So much of what Obama did was through the executive order, which is the easiest to undo for Trump because he doesn't even need Congress.
What people worry about here is whether that will be, as it were, imported here in some new trade deal.
There will be a race to the bottom.
In your book, you talk about political shock being a deliberate strategy to unsettle people. Just explain to us a little bit about what you mean.
Well, there has been this strategy in place now for on the right for half a century of using profoundly destabilizing moments, various kinds of shocks where people wake up in a country that feels profoundly different than the one they went to sleep in, and understanding that in those moments when people are deeply frightened and disoriented after the 2008 financial crisis, I would argue after the Brexit vote as well, when the ground is shifting.
You can use that to ratchet politics in one direction or another.
Yeah, sometimes it's referred to as a moment of extraordinary politics. But one of the things that's been interesting to me watching British politics from the other side of the Atlantic is it seems that these tactics really aren't working that well. I mean, there were all of these trial balloons floated after the Brexit vote about turning the UK into a giant tax haven. And from everything I'm hearing, things seem to be going in the other direction.
That's not the direction we're going.
Right, yeah.
Can I stay with British politics in that case, Heidi? There's a very interesting story about the Tory whips.
That's right.
In the papers today. And they're back to their old tricks. We used to have very, very brutal whipping in the 1970s when there was very small majorities from the Labour Party, and kneecaps were broken and people were ferreted out of toilets and forced into the voting lobbies on stretchers.
You're assuming that stopped now, obviously. You're assuming that stopped now.
Well, it's certainly restarting again, according to this story. It's restarting again.
Yeah, it's really disappointing. A story that suggests that sort of PPSs, the private secretaries that work for the various ministers, are going to be the eyes and ears of the whips and find out what conversations are being held about leadership sort of campaigns. And I find it worrying and disappointing because, for me, the whole way that the Tory party will be what it needs to be and change, which you so desperately need to do, is when we start talking to each other and start trusting each other. It's those whispers in corridors and power games and egos that have got us into this position in the first place, and this has got to stop. So the SW1 Stasi are not what we need more of, you would say now. No. Let's keep moving on. We haven't really talked much about the Brexit story in the Sunday Telegraph. Big story.
This is a very, very big story. It turns out that we have got a Downing Street source which briefed business to say that in the course of the negotiations, it's highly likely that the Prime Minister will walk out over the issue of the bill that we pay for the divorce from the EU. Now, if you're going to enter negotiations, it's unwise to go around in advance briefing people about what you're going to do.
It seemed odd to me, I must say.
It's doubly unwise if you brief them that the walkout will be, quote, for domestic consumption. In other words, this is not really about, in the long run, achieving a reduced divorce bill. This is about sending a message to British voters who, according to every poll, hate the thought of us paying a huge divorce bill, that the government is hanging tough. And
so I'm going to do something theatrical, but don't worry, because I'll tell you about it first, and I don't really mean it.
And of course, if you know who done it in the play is much less enjoyable.
You don't bother going to watch it.
It rather loses its point, doesn't it? So this is a huge error, and it speaks to this sense, this extraordinary switch in the fortunes of the government that has gone from being strong and stable, as it famously sold itself in the election as being the only party that can negotiate a tough, proper Brexit, to one which appears to just be falling apart on the subject.
We're almost out of time. Naomi Campbell, very, very... I beg your pardon. Naomi Wolf.
No, I'm flattered.
Naomi Campbell would be great on the sofa too. I hasten to add, if she's watching. If she's watching. Klein. Naomi Klein. We haven't talked about Grenfell, which is the other huge story of the week, of course, carries on being a big story. Yeah. Just give us the headline that kind of most struck you from the...
Oh, well, I think this story about being told to bury this fire report about...
These are firefighters.
Who used to be a firefighter and now it seems working for some sort of private company. Don't tell anyone about the fire risks. And I think this relates to the, what's being described as chaos, but the fact that residents don't trust the people who are supposed to represent them. Why would they when they're hearing about buried reports? And, I think this is so much about a crisis of democracy more than anything else.
Certainly, it's all about trust. We've been talking about a lot of trust this morning. Thanks to all of you very much indeed.
Well, let's have a look at what's on the front pages this morning. The Observer says Theresa May is under pressure to ease austerity and end the public sector pay cap. The Mail on Sunday says the Prime Minister is considering a major U-turn on tuition fees to try and win young voters from Labour. Mrs May could storm out of Brexit talks if the EU demands a big divorce bill. That's in the Sunday Telegraph. The Sunday Express leads on government plans to take back control of UK fishing waters after Brexit. The Sunday Times claims members of the SAS have tried to cover up the killing of unarmed Afghan civilians by a rogue unit. And the Sunday Mirror pictures footballer Jermaine Defoe alongside cancer patient Bradley Lowry. Well, joining us now to talk about the big stories this Sunday morning are the journalist and author Toby Young, BuzzFeed senior reporter Ayesha Ghani and the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt. Hello, thanks very much for being with us this morning. Lots of things in the newspapers this morning. It kind of feels as though Conservative ministers all over the place are coming out and perhaps saying things that the Prime Minister might not be best pleased about. We've got Tory chaos over tuition fees U-turn on the Mail on Sunday, which seems quite remarkable, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty beefed up headline, you know, Tory chaos. But what Damien Green, May's number 2, has basically said is that there should be a national debate over tuition fees. And of course, you know, it's 7 years ago where we had the whole Clegg mania and students coming out protesting on the streets. And to have this shift, I think that is significant that we're having this discussion.
And do you think that's because they're so worried about all the support Jeremy Corbyn got at the election from young voters?
Exactly. Here we have Labour leading the policy on this issue. And you just had Vince Cable on saying that it was a cheap populist move, really, and saying that it was, you know, Tories being scared of the fact that you have so many young voters voting for Labour, and there was a huge turnout this election. And Tories are 30 points behind Labour on younger voters. But I think it is missing a key thing here. I mean, if we're talking about 18 to 35-year-olds and what I write about in BuzzFeed, they care about austerity. They care about the fact that they're working long hours and they can't afford rent, for example. These are the real issues that people are talking about and that my readers are talking about. Whereas here, you know, we're focusing on tuition fees. Yes, it makes headlines, but those are the real issues that they need to be discussing if they're talking about national debate.
Well, I think there should be a national debate on this, but I hope the conclusion of that debate is to keep tuition fees where they are or even allow universities to raise them, because since tuition fees have been introduced, the participation rates in higher education of people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds has gone up, and last year it was the highest on record. And in Scotland, where they don't charge tuition fees, the participation rate of disadvantaged students in HE is actually lower. I mean, why should people who don't go to university, 60% of the English population, have to pay more in tax to subsidise those who do, who are going to be earning more? It's a regressive policy.
Is this just panicking then, you think, by the Conservative Party?
I don't think the Conservative Party is going to do a U-turn on tuition fees. I think it's, I'm afraid to say, as you say, Vaisha, it's a trumped-up headline. It's a very thin story. Damien Green said this with the blessing of Theresa May. There is no Tory chaos. It's nonsense.
But, you know, 9k is just awfully too much, especially for people who are saddled with debt for many, many years. Let's
move on to this story in the Observer, shall we? A poll finding that 60% of Brits want to keep their EU citizenship as Brexit fears grow. Well, if that's right, do we believe polls anymore, then that's a considerable number of people who voted leave as well, isn't it, Ian Dunn?
Yeah, exactly, because obviously this is the part of what do you get for that, and one of the things that you get from EU membership is you get to live wherever you want, you get to, you know, meet someone and love them and stay in their country if that's where they are, you get to work wherever you want. The problem that we had during the referendum campaign was that it was all about I want, and what do we not give to others? Blocking, you know, freedom of movement of people coming in or doing the same thing on goods. Now we're starting to see people recognise the things that they are about to lose by the process that is taking place. And if you look, even to see the interviews that you were doing before, almost the entirety of the Brexit debate now is about damage limitation. How do we limit the damage to this country by the decision that it has taken? You almost never hear anyone coming up with these great sunlit uplands that we're going to suddenly reach of, you know, this sort of almost messianic stuff that you'd hear from Gove and Boris beforehand. That debate is dead, and when you start looking at this, you start to see a dawning public realisation about the severity of the loss that is about to affect people's personal lives.
I can see you nodding along there. I have a suspicion you might not be in the same camp.
I mean, I think it's a slightly misleading poll, because it says, you know, it asks Britons how many of them want to keep the right to live, work, study and travel in the EU, bundling all those things together, when very few of those things are actually at risk from Brexit. No one's suggesting that Britons ought not to be able to live in the EU. Britons living in the EU aren't going to have to come home. No, but work is what freedom of movement entails. You can go and live there if you don't work. No one's saying that that's under threat.
Travel.
I mean, I travelled to France before we were members.
No, travel's fine, but you can't go to live in another country.
Of course, people want to protect their travel, but that's not under threat.
In a way, it's a bit surprising.
Even studying. I mean, Norway's in Erasmus. Norway's not part of the EU, so it's possible we may.
It's in the single market, which means that it has freedom of movement.
EU. It's work.
You don't have the right to go and live. So, I mean, for instance, in the US, you don't have the right to just go and live there. You might be able to find a job that you can get that means you can stay for the duration of the job. But that is another matter entirely. Of course, it is simply a matter of fact that we're going to lose the right to live and to travel freely.
I don't think the Spanish government is going to stop people buying property in Marbella if they happen to be British citizens.
You may presume otherwise, but when we lose freedom of movement, those are the rights that we lose.
Let's try and pierce through.
There are smaller things such as mobile tariff rates. You know, those things when we can go to Europe now, we don't have to pay as much, and things like this is of concern for a lot of people. So you know that's why.
The way you can argue, it's quite surprising that 40% of people say that they don't want to keep their right to travel to the EU.
I mean, who wouldn't want to retire in Spain? Yeah.
The other slightly misleading thing about this poll is they didn't say to people, do you want to keep your right to work in the EU, even if it means preserving freedom of movement? It didn't ask that question. And when the British public are asked about freedom of movement, something like the same percentage, 60%, want to see it ended because they want to see immigration reduced. So, you know, it's a poll in which the questions were designed to solicit this kind of response. Slightly dodgy.
We haven't got too long left, so let's just talk about the story that's in the Independent today. Glastonbury Festival, apparently, we hear, has hired hundreds of workers from across Europe on 0-hours contracts and then fired them after just 2 days. A little bit embarrassing.
I mean, it's the irony of Jeremy Corbyn kind of addressing the festival goers at Glastonbury as if addressing the oppressed proletariat, when every single one of them paid £238 to be there. And of course, when they cheered him and greeted him as the new Messiah, what they didn't realise is that if Labour was elected and enacted its policy, increasing the minimum wage, banning 0-hours contracts, festivals like Glastonbury would almost certainly not be able to take place. And this story proves it. A lot of the workers which made Glastonbury possible were on 0-hours contracts. So if Labour were elected and banned 0-hours contracts, Glastonbury would cease to exist.
You're right to point out that this is very negative, but at the same time, this thing about spending 230 quid on a ticket means that, you know, you have to be somehow super rich or very spoilt is nonsense. People on low incomes can save up. They save up for satellite TV, they save up for a holiday in Spain, and to write people off because they're able to spend 200
quid.
But it's a middle-class festival.
It's not a middle-class festival. I was there.
A lot of people at Glastonbury work, don't they, to get free tickets as well?
Absolutely. They clean toilets, which is not a pleasant experience at Glastonbury.
No, that would be, quite something.
But obviously, this is a really upsetting story, and it's up to the organisers to be paying people the wage they should be they deserve. I mean, people are being told that they couldn't have food, for example, after working long shifts. Like, that is the issue here. Like, they need to be held to account.
OK, thanks very much for all your views on this morning's papers.